Here to discuss cyber attacks, silent but deadly, are speakers from Dixon Hughes Goodman, Lori Haley, partner, DHG Dealerships, and Tom Tollerton, manager, DHG IT Advisory. Please give them both a warm welcome.
So good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here with you today. My name is Lori Haley. I'm a partner with our DHG Dealerships practice located in Birmingham, Alabama. Work in and around dealerships pretty much on a daily basis. So hopefully we're going to bring you some content today that'll be informative and helpful to you as you think about how cyber attacks and that whole subject matter can be affecting your dealership practice. Tom Tollerton is with me here today. He's a manager in our IT advisory practice and really an expert in this whole field. So he's going to also share some knowledge with you here today. As a quick review of our agenda for the day, just so you can kind of understand what we're going to cover here, we're going to start a little bit to give you a good feel for what the landscape looks like out in the environment today with respect to cyber. Specifically, talk a little bit about what the dealership environment in that looks like. We're going to move a little bit along to some security breach trends so you can see what are the latest and greatest, what are some of the different modes of attack and things that you should be aware of that are out there today. We'll move a little bit on into some specific threats, share some case studies with you, some stories and examples of things that are going on and that we're seeing in dealerships daily that have to do with some of these different breaches and events. And we'll follow that up with and close today a little bit with some actions that you can take to move down the path to a little bit better security in your environment and how you can make some steps there. Again, thinking about the general landscape and just trying to get some general feel for where we are. This is really to start off, really start to think about this as a business problem, and hopefully everybody understands this is not just an IT thing. One of the slogans that I saw recently while I was traveling through one of the airports was cybersecurity issues are now CEO issues. And so one of the messages that we'd like to share today is that there are a lot of very far-reaching impacts to some of these events that are happening out there in the cyberspace, and it's important to think about this as much broader than just an IT issue. I think it goes without saying that data security breaches are increasing. We're seeing a lot more activity in the space, certainly not just in the dealership environment, across all industries, across all businesses, and really, quite frankly, across all sizes of businesses. And certainly, many folks get to hear about the very high media profile incidences like Target and Home Depot and things like that. But quite frankly, your business is really a target, probably even more so as a medium to small size business than some of these really large businesses. The other thing to think about is just your data. Understand what your mission critical data is, and understand that as a dealership in your environment, you have in your systems a lot of extremely sensitive consumer financial information. It's a target, and folks know that you have that type of information in your business. So it makes you even, a greater target for some of these crimes of opportunity. You already operate in an environment where the FTC, GLBA, PCI standards because of credit cards, all of these different regulations are already upon you, and it is because you have that very target-rich environment with data. The other thing to think about as we just described the general landscape and the dealership environment is just that many of the dealers tend to think of this as kind of an unnecessary cost, and they really haven't put the dollars or investment around having some security in place to really respond to some of the threats that are out there. Just as an area that we don't see a lot of focus in, and quite frankly, some of these, there are costs involved in trying to protect your business a little bit in this area, but those preventative costs far outweigh the risks. And so one of the messages that we'd like to kind of drive home today is to start to think about just moving a few steps down the path to making your environment more secure. Lots of statistics that are out there around this information, and one of them that we'd like to share with you today is the average time that it takes to identify a breach. So if somebody has breached your system, what does that time period look like? And that is over 200 days. So the important thing to think about there is, it's over a half a year before somebody is aware in most cases that there has been a breach to their system. So that's a lot of time for somebody to be in there moving around in your system, having access to your data before you even have a chance to respond. So again, a far-reaching impacts to many of this. The other thing to think about is that, again, you have so much mission-critical information in your business that it's important to have a good security mindset built into your culture. So that's very much a tone at the top type thing. It's as an important part of your business strategy as some of the other elements that you think about with a more regular basis. When we look at some of the dealership architecture and understanding that environment, we see some things out there that, we see a lot of dealerships in the current environment that are growing. And it's a good thing. The industry is bringing us growth, and folks are adding stores to their group and whatnot. And that presents a little bit of a challenge in that we see some systems that have been kind of cobbled together. We don't have let's take a pause, let's take a cohesive look at our whole environment, our whole architecture, and how things are. So, at one point in time, that might have been done, and as the dealership group may have grown, they may not have done all the things that need to be done to kind of address that. We also have these cloud environments and different things, different ways that data is being stored now that creates different challenges. You also have an environment where you've got your DMS provider providing a core part of your applications that you might operate on, but in many cases you've got a lot of tack-on systems, parts management systems, back-end reporting systems, and so that makes for some complicated network environments that exist in the dealership space. Firewalls are another thing to be thinking about. Are those set up properly? When you think about your networks, there really isn't a reason that probably anybody in your organization should have access to all aspects of your network and all areas of your network. But quite often we find that's the case. By default, you just give access and they can get all the way through. So, getting proper firewalls set up in different parts of your network. Again, even a mentality about what firewalls are there, what the purpose of those firewalls are, certainly to prevent that further access to your system, but understanding the importance of making sure that you're checking the logs. How often is somebody probing before an attack is happening, and what does that activity look like, that suspicious activity? One of the other areas to think about is that many of the dealership environments, we talked about the lack of maybe investment dollars in the IT area. And to go a little bit further with that, when we think about that, there's a lot of outsourcing of the IT function in the dealership environments. And some of those companies are very, very good at keeping your systems up and running. When your employees have issues at their personal workstations and things like that. But in many cases, it's more of an help desk type environment, and those folks are not really engaged with you to be your security consulting vendor there. So understanding what your applications are with those different providers. Employees accessing the system remotely. This is very big right now because of the environment that we all operate in. It's a big, bring your own device to work. People are accessing your network systems from tablets and from smartphones and all different connections and ways to get into your network now, all these different end user points that you need to be aware of in understanding, do I have security at all of those levels, or have I really just thought about that environment of the PC on site at my dealership? So something to be thinking about there. Understanding your antivirus software, and making sure that those different systems, anti-malware, all of those things are being updated with some regularity. There's a lot of auto updates you can make sure that are turned on, or just being aware that if there's a patch out there, you've got that installed. Again, these folks that are out there, doing these crimes, these different cyber criminals, they're at it 100 of the time, 24/7. This is what they're doing, and so you've got to stay ahead of them and update your systems with patches and things in that area. If you have any of your operating systems, anybody is operating on a Windows XP environment, that's not being supported at all anymore. So any kind of a security weakness that exists there is not going to be patched or fixed. So something to be thinking about with making sure that you have updated equipment in your stores. Visitors and non-employees, making sure those folks are challenged when they're on site at your dealership. From a physical security perspective of being able to come into your dealership, kind of prey upon the trusting nature of those folks that you have in your employ, but also thinking about the accesses that may be granted to those different parties to do the work they do. Have you narrowed that access appropriately for those third-party vendors? Thinking about your copiers is another area. Those are computers that reside inside those copiers, and so all that data that flows over your copiers every day with all of that, again, sensitive consumer financial information is just flowing through, credit app information. When you trade out those copiers, turn them in at the end of the lease, you got to make sure those hard drives are wiped clean because all that data is there and present. Workstation security, I think if we had to give a report card on that at most of the dealerships that I am in on a daily basis, that probably gets a C or a D. Horrible workstation security. There's sticky notes posted up on people's monitors of what their password is. So pretty easy to get in there and get that. As you're thinking about passwords too, that happens to be an area that we're seeing more activity is stolen credentials to access a system. And so it's important that you have some protocols and some procedures in place, that you require your employees to have complex passwords, that you require them to change those passwords with some regularity. A best practice might be a 90-day password change, and to think about those different elements. 70% of people reuse their password across multiple applications between their professional lives, their personal lives, and so their network password, it could very possibly be the same password that they use on some of their social media. So when you get a break into one area, it kind of can open up things. So the bottom line, again, when we just talk about general dealership architecture and landscape, is to understand that for the most part what we see is pretty rudimentary environments that make you an easy target. And just like the other areas and elements of your business, understanding and getting your arms around a risk assessment is critically important. How exposed are you in this area? So some dollars in that area to understand, kind of a report card on yourself. If you do have an incident, a security incident, or a breach of your data, what can you expect from a perspective of cost, and what does that look like after an incident? There's a lot of dollars involved here. Some of them are hard dollars and intangible costs, and some of these are some intangible things to think about. But typically following a breach, you might engage some party to help you on a forensic investigation. Those are very, very costly because they involve some very skilled resources to get involved and do that work. Usually those folks work at a pretty high rate, and there's a lot of time involved. It takes time to figure out where that breach occurred in your system. It's also an intangible as a distraction of your business. Somebody from your group is going to be involved in helping facilitate and liaise on that forensic investigation and some of these other elements that we'll talk about further down here, and that's a lot of distraction to what you all do daily and want to be doing in your business. Regulatory and industry fines are a big thing to be thinking about when a breach occurs. There's some required reporting when an incident happens like that, and so the FTC, some of the states, there's all kinds of compliance around all of that, and potential penalties that again are hard dollars. Remediation of your vulnerabilities. So, once you have a forensic investigation or you figure out how your system was compromised, in order to remediate and fix that, it can be very costly. Again, you're talking about a time-consuming task in many cases to rebuild parts of your system that may have been compromised. Data restoration is a very time-consuming element here. Litigation is another thing that could potentially be an element when you have a breach. Again, when you're talking about sensitive consumer financial information. That's always a threat that's out there with lawsuits that could come down the pike. And really the biggest intangible that I think it's important for everybody to think about is just brand damage. You work hard to build your brand out there, and sometimes an incident like this can be extremely damaging to your brand, and in some cases really even take a business down. So really far-reaching impacts, as we talked about at the beginning, and just to get your mind around what a threat this is to your business. I'm going to let Tom talk a little bit here about some of the trends, and again, some of the specific types of attacks that we're seeing here with some regularity.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. Appreciate that. And I think this slide really is kind of the reason that we're all here, quite frankly, is to get our minds around what the cost, how it impacts us. We hear about cybersecurity out in the industry, whether it's the financial sector, whether it's retail, healthcare, and in some cases dealerships. But how does it impact me? And how does it impact my dealership and my business? And this slide, I think, really does help kind of demonstrate exactly what you'd be facing in the event following a breach. You know, we won't dwell too long into statistics, but I think that there are some valuable statistics out there in a lot of the reports that are produced. First up, in almost 2/3 of cases, attackers are able to compromise an organization within just a matter of minutes. So we're not talking about long, drawn-out attempts to compromise a dealership, hacking a firewall, trying to brute force their way in. It really just can happen in a matter of minutes, depending upon the vector of attack. And related to that, stolen credentials, quite frankly, is the most popular way that attackers are getting through networks. So it does not need to be punching a hole through a firewall, if you will. If an attacker is able to gain access to authorized credentials from someone who actually does have appropriate access to a particular application or set of data, the attacker really doesn't need to do any additional hacking. All they have to do is use the authorized credentials, and they are in. Frankly, last year, I thought this was interesting. In a third of cases, in a third of recorded breaches, the victims were small and medium-sized organizations. We all see the big headline breaches, the Targets, the Home Depots, the merchants, if you will, with the millions of credit card numbers, the millions of social security numbers that are compromised. But in reality, the low-hanging fruit for these attackers are the small and medium-sized organizations, and this is for a couple of reasons. Most typically, small and medium-sized organizations, particularly dealerships that are traditionally unregulated from a security standpoint, owners and managers don't believe that they have the data or the volume of data that would be of value to attackers. And quite frankly, that's what attackers prey upon. They know that there is this mentality out there, and they take advantage of those type of organizations. And I think the second reason for this particular trend is the organizations that do care, that are too small maybe too small to invest a significant amount of money in resources and personnel into completely securing their organization from external attackers. So very important for small and medium-sized organizations to be paying attention, particularly to this presentation, but really just what's going on in the industry in general. And then the last statistic talks about malware as being the primary vector of attack these days. It's not just sitting trying to get in through a firewall, again, by brute forcing their way through. Malware or malicious software that gets installed via what we'll call phishing attacks and other social engineering attacks that we'll talk about in a second. This is really making it very easy for attackers to compromise a dealership and organization. Now we'll skip this slide, and we'll skip the next slide, and we'll jump right to the next slide. So in our work, we see some commonalities across data breaches in our incident response engagements, and frankly, external attackers are still the #1 threat out there. The internal threat is always a concern, someone inside of your organization trying to steal information that might be valuable, but in reality, from a hacking perspective, it's typically somewhere overseas, Russia or China. Some foreign nation is the source of most attacks. And we talked about the target breach a second ago. Very often, the vulnerability that leads to an attack is not a vulnerability in your dealership's network. It might be one in a vendor or third party who has access into your network. So again, to the Target example, Target wasn't breached because their network was compromised. An HVAC vendor, heating and vacuuming and AC unit vendor, was compromised. That vendor had way too much access into Target's network and was able to compromise point of sale systems and collect credit card data as the data flowed through their point of sale servers. That was an issue of vendor management more so than a technical vulnerability with that particular retailer. And again, going back to Lori's statistic earlier about the time it takes to detect a breach, it takes months very often before an organization even knows that they've been breached. Not that they've remediated the vulnerability, that they've gone through litigation, but just almost a year before organizations actually know that there's something going on in their network. And that's kind of a scary statistic, because if an attacker is able to compromise an organization for that long, they're typically able to jump around and get to different things and then install backdoors. So if a vulnerability is closed that allowed an attacker in, they may have created a second or a third or a fourth backdoor that could cause future compromise. Breached entities often will learn about the compromise from a third party. It may not be their own IT staff, their own IT vendor. It may be, in some unfortunate cases, the FBI or the Secret Service that manage the United States currency that actually come knocking on the door. And that's not a call or a knock that you want to receive. It may be a third-party vendor who has to tell you that they've been compromised and that you need to go check the rest of your network and your data to make sure that information wasn't compromised. We'll talk about sort of specific vulnerabilities and exploits in a second, but typically the initial exploit is something easy, like a compromised password or a missing patch. It only takes one system on your entire network that's accessible from the internet to be compromised in order for your entire network to be compromised. And we always tell clients that it's much cheaper to spend the money up front to reduce the impact and scope of an attack through effective preventative measures than it is to deal with a huge incident response case post-security incident. So what are some of the evolving modes of attack? How are attackers actually coming at dealerships these days? We talked about the weak vendor situation a second ago. Strong vendor management programs are absolutely critical, and pushing down your own security program requirements to your vendors is something that we definitely recommend to all of our clients across industries, simply because if they have access to your data, they need to be protecting it as well as you are. Mobile devices, everything that we do today, we have traditionally done on computers, can now be done today on phones and tablets and mobile devices. And so we're seeing an upward trend in malware on particularly Android devices, but also on iOS, Apple devices, and Microsoft Windows mobile devices as well. And that trend will only continue as the proliferation of mobile devices continues. Social media is a very popular vector of attack. Embedded links in things like Facebook posts or Twitter posts, tricking you to click on a link, opening up a web page that may have malicious code installed. Memory scrapers. This is an extremely sophisticated form of malware out right now that actually sits in memory of a running system and captures data as it passes through memory. Any data going through a system goes through memory. And so as in the Target case, if credit card numbers are the string that are being collected, those will be captured to a data text file, captured, saved, stored, and sent off to the attacker at a predetermined predetermined interval for their malicious use. And that's frankly a form of anti-forensic. It's an anti-forensic methodology. So attackers are getting so good that the forensic investigators are having trouble even detecting that they were there. Their malware is now running in volatile memory that gets deleted every time a system is rebooted. Malware doesn't need to be installed traditionally as traditional software is. It can just run while the system is running, and once it's rebooted, the system is rebooted, it's gone. It's a big challenge for us in the forensic industry. And then social engineering, we'll talk about here for a few minutes. frankly, it's the number one attack method for the reason that I mentioned earlier, that attackers prefer to get access, to get authorized access by compromising an authorized individual, as opposed to trying to brute force from the outside. And we'll talk about what that looks like here in a second. We all may remember the 419 email phishing scam from a decade or two ago, where someone like a Nigerian prince would promise you a large sum of money if you would just let him borrow a little bit initially. And as hard as it may be to believe, but that actually was a successful form of attack for a while. Now we recognize there are grammatical issues and we know the scheme, and so we really don't pay any attention to it. But I bring that up to show you what phishing attacks very often look like today. And this particular slide shows an email phishing attack designed to look like it came from American Express. And what you see here is an email that uses HTML graphics, so it looks, trendy and fashionable. It includes official logos from American Express. It attempts to deceive you into thinking there's an account number there, when in fact it's just a bank identification number, and that's common to virtually all American Express credit cards. But for the unknowing user, they may trust it and believe it as some sort of verification and double-click and open the attachment that is attached. And typically these sorts of phishing attacks will include some sort of urgency to do something, to click on a link, to open an attachment in order to solve a problem that you need to remedy immediately. Here's another example designed to look to be from PayPal, and I highlight this to give you kind of a tip that if you are instructed to click on a link within an email, you can hold your mouse over the link, and it will show you the full URL of the link that you would be visiting if you click the link. So it says Resolution Center, but in reality, the domain is paypal-secure-check.com, which is not a domain owned by PayPal. So the top-level domain .com is a commercial website. The text immediately to the left of that dot would be the domain that you were visiting. So you would expect to see a domain with paypal.com. Obviously, this is a phishing attack. You can tell also by the grammar and by the urgency in the email to fix something. I will tell you that typically financial institutions will not have you click a link in an email to go solve a problem. They will tell you, go log into your account on our website to help give you some comfort about the appropriate way to access your account. So those were examples of phishing attacks. There's a newer form of phishing you may have heard of called spear phishing. And as opposed to being a broad spectrum attack sent out to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of email addresses, spear phishing is targeted to a very particular set of individuals or a specific organization. And this is a spear phishing attack trying to convince an individual to complete a wire transaction, a fraudulent wire transaction. And you can tell that it's a spear phishing attack. It's a relatively sophisticated one. You see in the to field jsmith@companydomain.com, and that's the company's website, companydomain.com. But you see in the from field, the sender is jdoe@companydomain.us. So this attacker did some reconnaissance. He went out and purchased the companydomain.us domain, which looks like the .com domain, and sent an email from it attempting to deceive Jane into completing a transaction. And if Jane wasn't paying attention, she might go through and complete a transaction, sending a total of $98,500 out to the attacker. And once that's completed, there really isn't anything that can be done to stop that transaction. Here's a very similar example, and this is actually an example that we've seen out in the field. If you start at the bottom of this particular email, the attacker asks someone in accounting if they're available. The individual replies yes, and then the attacker asks the person to complete a wire transfer, a fraudulent transaction. What do you need to be able to do this? And then the accountant says, I need this individual's name, the bank routing, and account number, and we'll send it along. Unfortunately, he or she fell for this, and the money was transferred to the attacker. So now I want to talk for just a second about malware specifically and how easy it is right now to get your hands on malware. You do not need to be a sophisticated coder or a graduate of MIT or some computer science school. Malware is available right on the internet, and you can buy packages designed to do exactly what you want them to do. And on this slide, I have some screenshots from Darknet where individuals or organizations are selling packages of malware, an Android remote access toolkit or a RAT tool for an Android device. It includes the piece of software, and it would include some email addresses that you could send your phishing email to that would run the code that installs this remote access tool. The other example I have is a variant of ransomware, and you can buy that package. Looks like for about $500. And again, you'd get the software and you would get the medium or vector of attack, how to send it out, and just sit and wait and see who clicks on it and whose systems are vulnerable. And once they're installed, you'll get notification, and the process just goes from there. But this is just an example of how sophisticated and how easy it is, and how using graphical interfaces that anyone can perpetrate these type of attacks. So ransomware specifically, we may have heard of. It's a form of malware that installs silently in the background, following typically a phishing attack, clicking on a link or a malicious attachment. Once it's installed, it silently encrypts files of value in the background by extension. So spreadsheet files, .xls, .xlsx typically, Word doc files, PDF files, music files, video files, and in the case of businesses, very often SQL database files or other proprietary data files within an organization. Once that encryption process is complete, a splash screen will come up that looks very similar. This is called a crypto locker variant of ransomware. And the victim is given a time window, time left, and it's a clock, it's a countdown timer. And the victim is given instructions on how to respond and how to gain access to their data back. And it's just as it sounds, ransomware. Their data is being held ransom, and they're told how to pay and how much to pay for access back to their data. And that once that timer ticks down to 0, they may or may not be given more time to pay, but the longer you go without paying, the higher the fee becomes. And this particular instance, at the time of infection, 1 Bitcoin was worth $291. It might go up to 2 Bitcoin if you don't pay within 48 hours, and so forth. And so for one machine, that doesn't seem like a whole lot of money, but if ransomware breaks out in your network and tens or hundreds or thousands of systems are compromised, that can add up very quickly. So ransomware, we're finding right now, and there's consensus in the cybersecurity industry, that it's the #1 threat facing all businesses. And it's an interesting threat in that it's a shift away from the exfiltration model of attack. We've talked a lot about data breaches here, but this is a form of extortion. And so while you may not lose the integrity or privacy of your data, you do lose security in that you can't access it. And you can't trust the attacker, obviously, that is withholding access. It's a very simple business model. We talked a second ago about being able to just go buy malware packages and waiting for someone to end up with a compromised system. It's difficult to trace. The use of Bitcoin makes it very difficult to chase these individuals down, as well as the international component. Bitcoin is an unregulated, very volatile currency, digital currency right now. The value of it rises and drops fairly quickly and very, very frequently, but it's a form of currency that can't be traced, so it's popular among attackers. Easy to acquire and deploy, and there's multiple variants, and the variants are becoming very sophisticated. We talked about the one system model that gets compromised. Current variants have the capability to spread across networks. Once they've infected one machine, they'll spread to other machines on the very same network and do the same process, resulting in potentially hundreds or thousands of workstations that are compromised. And if good data backups haven't been taken, there may be no choice, unfortunately, than to pay the ransom. We always discourage paying the ransom if at all possible, because paying the ransom only encourages the attackers and perpetrates this sort of attack going forward. So Lori, do you want to talk about a couple of case studies?
Sure. Sure. We thought this would be helpful to give you a couple examples of some things that we have seen specifically in dealerships. We've talked a lot today about some of the different modes of attack, and certainly you're aware that those are going on in other businesses, but we wanted you to hear a little bit about some of the things and specific stories of things we've run across in the past year and a half with clients and others in the business. The first example, again, a vulnerable network situation where they didn't have the type of security that they needed to have in place just to prevent that access, allowed the hacker in this situation to basically get into the system and then download some areas where they were monitoring the keystrokes of the controller of the dealership. So just patiently watching and waiting and following that along until they hit a point where there was a bank login and those credentials were apparent to the hacker, what was the login and what was the password to get to the dealership's bank site. And so then the hacker was able to go remotely to another device of their own and log in and initiate, in this case, a transfer of some funds, and the dealership was not able to have any recovery there. So that was one of the examples that we've seen pretty recently. Another one, and we've seen one example of this today. We highlight this because I've actually had 4 clients in the last 12 months come across incidences like this that have come across, and it's preying upon the human element, where they're getting in there and they're preying upon your people and the trusting nature, and again, being patient, looking at your website, figuring out who are the folks within your organization that might have access to certain functions, going in, compromising your system. And in a couple of those cases, they all involved wire transfers of funds from unauthorized individuals in some cases, or authorized individuals, and preying upon those people. In one of the cases that Tom showed earlier, that string of emails, what happened there was a compromise of the system such that the dealer's email address, which was, say, johndoe@abcdealership.com, was compromised, and it was printed in this email as johndoe1@abcdealership.com. And so when that email went across to the controller, with a very quick, busy day, you don't even notice that change in the email address, and that wire was initiated, those funds were transferred. Unfortunately, that wasn't even detected after one occurrence, and the following business day, same perpetrator had that same series of emails go along again. It looked and there were 2 wires that went on. That was $85,000 between the two before they noted that something was wrong, and really no recovery in either of those cases. So that's something we seem to be seeing with a little bit more regularity, and again, preying upon the fact that there really isn't a security awareness going on in the organization where people are questioning those types of things. You also have to think about one of the examples, think about your physical security. Wanted to give you a case also where we had a situation where a dealership was physically broken into. And while we may think that we're a paperless environment in a paperless world, we all know that not to be the case. And so you have these situations where, you've got a lot of data that resides in your deal jackets and other that's physically on site at your dealership. And so if you don't have the correct protections in place there, in this case, they were able to break in, pry open the cabinets, get to those deal jackets, and get access to that consumer financial information in that manner. Important to think about as we think about that case, to stay in compliance with the retention guidelines. You certainly have to keep data for the IRS and for certain state regulations for a certain period of time, and it's important to comply with those. But you do want to understand what those time periods are and not keep data well beyond those required timelines, because that makes you have even more data that is potentially could be compromised. Another example that we wanted to share with you, and this one had to do with that was actually the dealer in this case, that on a laptop that he utilized to access the dealership's network remotely, they also had some peer-to-peer file sharing applications on there, like a Dropbox type application. And the compromise was able to come in through the file sharing application, get into the network, access the dealership information through the network that way. And there was almost 100,000 customer records that were compromised and stolen in that incident. The FTC got involved in that one, sued the dealer, and the dealer went out of business within a year of that incident. So, thinking about how the implications of these types of things can be pretty far-reaching into your business. One last example I'll share has to do with just the data backups that hopefully are happening in your dealerships, in your store. And I think most people understand that backups are important, but where are those backups kept? Are you backing up to the cloud, or are you backing up to something that you are taking off-site? In this case, it was a stolen data backup. So while there was the first step was happening and they had backup procedures in place, which was a good thing, they were not being kept in an off-site type environment, and so it was very easy for someone to get at that backup and then have basically a backup of all of that information that was on the network. So just a few examples of some things that are specifically things we've seen right in the dealership space that you all operate in every day.
Oh, thanks, Lori. And to that point, we always ask the question to start, if you were to be breached, or if you were to have a security incident, who would be the first to notice it? Would someone well-educated in your organization that's on the lookout for these sorts of attacks, would they notice it? Would a vendor notify you, as we discussed earlier, or would an authority of some kind come knocking on your door? Those kind of questions can kind of help shape and give you an understanding of where you might stand from a cybersecurity standpoint, cybersecurity posture, as we call it. To start, just something to take away, what should qualify as a suspicious event if you think something's going on? In today's IT environment, frankly, any sort of phishing email that you see in your corporate email that has gotten through, some sort of spam email, that's an event in and of itself. That really should not happen anymore. It does happen, but we all need to be aware of it. And once it does happen, it's not just a matter of ignoring it or deleting it. We need to notify our IT department or our IT vendor and say, this got through, because you may be smart enough to recognize that it's a spam email, but if it got through the email filter for you, it may have gotten through for other individuals within your organization. And if they click on the email attachment, your organization is compromised just as if you did. Phone calls, on-site visits, we call these sorts of things phone phishing or vishing, as well as on-site social engineering attacks. These are very often used by attackers for reconnaissance reasons, trying to understand where data might be. In some of our assessments, we pretend to be a copy vendor, and that's a very common attack vector as well, trying to get access to a particular area of your company, whether it be an IT closet or file cabinets. They prey upon the human will to just be helpful, the human desire to do the right thing and to be helpful. And it's unfortunate, but receptionists and front office personnel are far too often just willing to let anyone back there thinking that they're doing the right thing, when in fact they're unfortunately compromising their organization. Strange-looking emails, they're getting more sophisticated, but anytime you see some sort of syntax or grammar or vernacular that seems out of sorts for the individual that you're communicating with, that's probably worth a second look as well. If they've included an attachment, if they've included a link, it's best to double check that that really should be that email should really be in your inbox. We've talked a lot about spoofing emails, making them look like they're coming from individuals that you know, and it's a very common attack vector right now. Unusual system behavior. This one seems fairly obvious. If you see a lot of pop-up windows, if you see icons for applications that you're not really familiar with, slow performance on your system, that typically indicates that something's happening in the background, especially in the event of a ransomware installation. That requires resources and can slow down your system. So if that sort of stuff is happening, absolutely report it to your IT provider. And what to do when you think that your computer might be infected. A lot of folks just want to turn the PC off. They just shut it off and set it aside and tell their IT provider. The reality is the best thing to do is leave it powered on, but unplug it from the network or turn off the wireless radio to disconnect it from the internet, as there can be valuable forensic information running in memory, as we've talked about today. Forensic information is really important when we conduct investigations and when any forensic investigator conducts investigation, trying to put together a timeline of events. Obviously contact IT as quickly as possible, and do run anti-malware, but do not delete malware files that may be found. If they're deleted and eventually overwritten by the computer, by Windows, in most cases, they may not be recoverable, and it makes it harder to come to a conclusion in putting together that timeline of events. So just quarantine the files, just separate them, and then leave the system unplugged from your network. And in general, we'll talk about some things to take away to help strengthen your security posture, but just know that it is going to require some level of investment, whether it's skill sets, resources, whether it's in-house personnel, having some sort of third-party assessment done, risk analysis or penetration test, whether it's infrastructure, software, hardware designed to help block attacks from the outside, or whether it's an improved vendor management program. There's some cost involved, time at the very least. And then user awareness is really something that requires some time. It need not be overwhelming, but it does need to be something that has due attention paid to it. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But some of the to-dos, some of the easy wins that we all can take away and begin to kind of incorporate into our own personal habits and the way we conduct business, and share as well with the folks that we work with. But number one, blocking malware. We've talked a lot about malicious software and the different kinds that are out there. The very basics are keeping Windows up to date. Microsoft releases patches at least once a month. You need to make sure that every single workstation on your network is getting patched regularly. All it takes is one system, again, to be vulnerable, that could be compromised. And then anti-malware speaks for itself. There are a lot of different anti-malware solutions out there. None of them are perfect. I get the question a lot, which one do you recommend? Which one do you think is the best? And the reality is that none of them catch everything. The industry leaders right now are very good, and I wouldn't choose one over the other, but one needs to be in place. It needs to be managed. The signature files need to be updated regularly, and scans need to be performed in real time. Those are the key practices that can really, really reduce a lot of risk when it comes to malware. We hear all the time the importance of strong passwords. And frankly, this can't be overstated. I gave you the statistic that password compromises were in almost 2/3 of the breaches that we see. What does it mean to have a strong password? Number one, it means not using the same password everywhere. The recent Yahoo email breach included a compromise of passwords associated with Yahoo accounts. And while it may be an email account that you might not use that frequently, you may not have sensitive data on it, if you're using that password associated with that account for your bank account or for one of your corporate web applications, attackers will attempt to try and to compromise those assets as well with that same password. It's very common and very effective. From a complexity standpoint, 8 characters is what we consider the standard minimum for length. A strong password need not be 20 to 25 characters with random strings of numbers and special characters and capital letters and lowercase letters. It needs to be 8 characters and with some combination of capital, lowercase, numbers, and special characters. And then, of course, changing that password periodically. I use a password manager in my phone, and I absolutely recommend that to anyone. There are several out there in your app stores, but they help generate secure passwords, and they help store your secure passwords, and you can retrieve them as needed. And you use one master password that can be super strong that you can remember to open the app. So you do have to have one super strong password. But remembering one is a lot better than using one multiple times, or also trying to have to remember a whole bunch of really long passwords. Third, don't request any sort of sensitive operation over email. Frankly, over the phone without some form of official protocol and verification. So don't request transactions, don't allow transactions to be conducted over email, don't request or send sensitive customer information, account numbers and social security numbers over email. Just bad practice, and if your email is compromised, then that data is compromised as well. Use consistent system configurations. Lori mentioned a little while ago that your IT shop, while it may be a very good organization, internal or contracted, very often their focus is on your ability to get your work done. So they're focused on availability more than they are security or data privacy. Sometimes security gets overlooked, and an example of that might be the need to get a replacement laptop for an executive whose laptop is broken, say a cracked screen or something like that. Going out and buying a laptop from the Best Buy or an Office Depot may get the job done to get them back online, but that system may not be hardened. It may not have the right anti-malware installed. It may not have appropriate security configuration set up. So rushing to do to get someone back online can open an organization up to potential exploit down the line. We talk about whitelisting authorized applications. This functionality is built into Windows. Modern variants of Windows, and there are also third-party solutions. But allowing only a specific set of applications to run on a system and preventing all the others ensures that some of this malware that we're talking about can't even execute when you if you double-click on it, or if you open a malicious website. And encryption of sensitive data, there really isn't much of an argument anymore for most organizations to be encrypting mobile devices, laptops, mobile phones, tablets. Anything that might leave your premises really needs to be encrypted. Hard drive encryption solutions are built into Windows as well, called BitLocker, and then third-party solutions are available as well at reasonable cost, but it's, again, reducing the risk of a potential attack. Potential compromise. And then backing up sensitive data. We talked a second ago about ransomware. Effective backups are the number one defense against ransomware. If you have a backup that you know is good for the data that got compromised yesterday, you don't have to worry about paying the ransom. You can simply wipe that system, whether it's a server or a workstation, then re-image it, reinstall all of your software, and then put the data back on it. It's a pretty simple way to get around it. But unfortunately, we go into organizations and backups are either not taken frequently enough, or not tested. And when they try and restore the data ends up, the backed up data tends to, or very often is not any good and actually doesn't work. So it's really important that data be backed up frequently and that data be tested periodically. So those are quick wins. What are some long-term actions that can be taken to improve cybersecurity posture? Any cyber insurance policy is going to start with a requirement for an organizational security policy. So having requirements for how you protect data, systems that would be in place, whether it be a firewall, a spam filter. And then they're going to require that someone be responsible for maintaining that security policy and that security program, vesting ongoing responsibility into an individual. Having a plan for incident response. So if you think that something has happened, what's your plan for addressing that? Do you know who to call? You call? Do you have an attorney that you call? Do you have cyber insurance? Do they have a hotline that you can call? Do you need to call your IT department, a forensic investigator? Just knowing what to do goes a long way to helping minimize the impact or scope of a potential security incident. Developing a security awareness program to combat the social engineering that we've talked about today is, quite frankly, really ought to be tops on this list. Strong security awareness does not need to be an expensive web-based tool that requires tests and ongoing assessment and so forth. It really should just start, particularly at the smaller dealerships, with emails. Someone, the security person responsible for maintaining the security policy should just send out emails periodically about best practices on how to safely surf the internet or safely use email. Emails ought to include current threats, things that are going on out in the cyber world, things like ransomware, just information. A little bit of that really goes a long way. More advanced logging and monitoring. Again, back to that statistic about how long it is until an organization discovers a data breach. You need to have effective logging, and you need to have someone watching that logging, whether that's your IT provider, whether that's a managed services provider that does it 24/7. Detecting an attack as early as possible in the attack chain is absolutely critical. And then performing an external assessment of your cybersecurity posture. So if your IT department or your IT provider doesn't have that security specialization, having a third-party organization do a risk assessment or conduct a penetration test, a social engineering assessment, or help you review policies. These are all really, really, really valuable practices that can kind of help guide you as to how to move your cybersecurity posture forward. Good cybersecurity is not an end state. It's not somewhere you get to. It's a process that's ongoing. It's something that needs to be built upon over time because this is not going anywhere. Quite frankly, attackers are more successful, unfortunately, these days, and their attacks are becoming more sophisticated. So keeping up with that really needs to be, as Lori states, a very high-level business priority. Thank you.